December 2018, suburbs of Pretoria, South Africa. After days spent hidden in their cellar, these last white inhabitants are finally being evacuated by the United Nations Intervention Force. Their neighbors did not get this chance. Earlier in the day, they were lynched by the crowd. Crushed by decades of a racist and brutal white government, the black communities of South Africa have finally seized power. Nobody was able to prevent the outburst of violence which followed. Thirsting for revenge, the oppressed have turned into oppressors. Fearing an ethnic cleansing, a fast intervention force was sent to evacuate the white populations to neighboring Zimbabwe. But none of that ever happened. In 1962, a small grain of sand will lead to the end of the apartheid government and the election of the first black president of South Africa. Our history is no more than a series of incredible events. Every one of us can influence its course. From the birth of a 1,000-year-old empire to the death of a flourishing civilization. From the creative genius of a handful of men to a worldwide cultural revolution. From the darkest of totalitarian visions to the most horrific of great wars. From the heroic resistance of an entire people to the iron determination of a minority. The most infinitesimal of our decisions can influence the future of humanity. To know the past is to foresee the future. (1836), the southern tip of Africa. Thousands of Boer settlers leave their home to migrate inland. May 26, 1948, the National Party wins the elections. The new government has a free hand to establish apartheid. August 5, 1962, the black leader Nelson Mandela is found and arrested by South African police. These three key events led South Africa to the verge of a civil war during the terrible period of apartheid. December 16, 1838, southern tip of Africa. Mortally wounded by a gunshot, this young Zulu warrior knows he is going to die. Before him, the river is red with the blood of his brothers in arms. They have not succeeded in repelling these demons who came to steal their land. His eyes are becoming glazed. In his mind, he remembers the ancient tales of white men invading the continent centuries ago. These white men are Dutch. They are here to found a colony at the southern tip of the African continent. 1652 marks the beginning of a story as complicated as it is violent. During the following years, the small colony develops with the arrival of French, German, and Scandinavian settlers, all carried by Protestant faith. But quickly, the colony is short of manpower and space. The first issue is solved by the massive influx of slaves. The second is settled with the conquest of bordering territories inhabited by Khoikhoi, Bushmen, or Xhosa people. But unlike the Europeans, the natives don't own firearms. The white settlers, soon to be called Boers, a term referring to peasants, take root on the African continent. However, in 1795, the balance of power changes dramatically. The British Empire seizes the colony and imposes its authority over the Boers. A minority group at the beginning, the British population booms with the massive arrival of migrants. In 1828, English became the dominant language. Anglicanism has emerged as the state religion. British law has replaced Dutch law. The Boers fear that their identity is in danger of disappearing. In 1833, slavery is abolished by the British. Alarmed, the Boers see their whole economic system called into question. During the following years, more than 15,000 Boers flee the British order and migrate inland in order to carry on with their lifestyle. a true exodus. This central and founding event of the Boers and their identity is called the Great Trek. In search of virgin lands, they come across territories occupied by African tribes. In 1838, they enter the land of the expanding Zulu Empire. War is inevitable. On December 16th, 15,000 Zulus surround a few hundred settlers entrenched in a circle of wagons. But unlike the Boers, the Zulus don't have guns. 3,000 young warriors are massacred by gunfire. The river of the battlefield, filled with Zulu blood, will later take the name of Blood River.
Welcome to the memory of humanity. Every historical event, regardless of how small, is recorded and connected. You only need to change one to upset all the others. Here, we're able to control time, analyze and compare billions of events in order to rewrite history in infinite ways. The Boers believe they are chosen by God and invested with a divine mission. Gradually, they will start to believe in their own destiny and compare their own fate with the exodus of the Jews in the Old Testament. Over time, the Great Trek becomes the foundation stone of Boer society. The Boers are convinced of a divine intervention in the miraculous victory in the Battle of Blood River. This idea could be compared to the Mormon ideology during the conquest of the West. Invested with a divine mission, they migrated to inhospitable, wide land in order to preserve their beliefs and way of life. Now, an inward-looking community, and carried along by their steadfast faith, the Boers developed their own concept. Persecuted, they have no other solution than surviving at all cost.
1902. Republic of the Transvaal. This Boer farmer has lost everything. After years of heroic fighting against British troops, he has seen his government accepting to surrender. Back home, in the farm he built by himself, he learned of the death of his wife and his 3 children in one of the many British internment camps. Like every Boer, he knows their fate has reached a tragic turning point. Someday, his people will be doomed if he and his peers don't do anything. Everything started a few decades ago. Following the Great Trek, the Boers founded many republics. The Natalia Republic, immediately annexed by the British, then the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, officially tolerated by the Crown. Everything changed when, in 1866, diamonds, then gold, are discovered on their land. For the Empire, missing such a financial godsend was out of the question. These territories become the scene of 2 wars between white settlers. 2 dreadful modern wars. Indeed, the British Army is well ahead of its time. Scorched earth policy, fortified houses, human shields. There are tens of thousands of Boer civilians, mainly women and children, crammed into about 50 internment camps. 28,000 of them will never return. A quarter of the Afrikaner population vanishes. The survivors are traumatized for decades. These white farmers, already full of resentment and hatred, are afraid to see their nation dying out in a vast territory inhabited with black men and ran by powerful Anglo-Saxons. They have no choice. They must adapt themselves or they will disappear. They reluctantly submit to the Crown. The Union of South Africa is created in 1910 and immediately joins the Commonwealth.
The symbolism of words. The word Boer means peasant. In English, its pronunciation is similar to the word Boer. Confronted with the threat to be assimilated to the British, the Boers assert their identity. They begin to refer to themselves by the word Afrikaner. This term designates any person speaking Afrikaans, a language derived from Dutch and tinged with French, Portuguese, and native languages. The word Afrikaans, which means African, allows them to assert some legitimacy on this new continent and to turn their back on their distant European roots. On the other hand, British people are called outlanders, which means foreigners. The Dutch term lager or liga in English, referring to the wagon fort formed by the settlers every evening to protect themselves from the attacks, gradually becomes the symbol of the status of Afrikaners, permanently surrounded and in the minority, fighting to the death. There is often a greater meaning behind a mere word.
March 21st, 1960. This black man is in a state of shock. He has been fighting for years against the deep inequalities which poison his country. Today, all of his beliefs are being dashed. Legal action won't be enough, not against this racist and criminal government. As a lawyer, he saw the situation getting worse year after year, law after law, quite legally. Since the British arrived, black people have always been reduced to a cheap workforce. Areas have been segregated on the pretext of fighting crime, but in fact for economic reasons. While white people live in town and own good lands, black people have inherited infertile soil and industrial areas. Just after World War I, while South Africa gets its autonomy from the British Empire, Afrikaner nationalists fight to win back absolute power and expel the English-speaking middle class from it. But for white workers, there is a new danger. The cheap black workforce which threatens their jobs, and an ever-increasing black population. There is an expression for this danger. Swart gevaar, the Black Peril. On May 26, 1948, the elections are won by the pro-Afrikaner National Party. A policy of separate development is immediately established by the government. The Apartheid regime is born. Obsessed with the survival of their way of life and traditions, Afrikaner leaders take refuge behind unjust laws and acquire a judicial arsenal. The Population Registration Act defines racial membership according to subjective requirements, all South Africans being classified into one of 4 racial groups based on their skin color: white, black, Indian, and mixed race or colored. The Group Areas Act sets boundaries for authorized residential areas. Black populations pack into townships, which are overpopulated second-class towns. The Immorality Amendment Act forbids interracial sexual relationships, and owning a passbook for every black man over 16 is made compulsory. In 1951, a law lays the foundations of the Bantustan system. 10 divided territories are designated to become new black nations. Black people have no other choice than moving from their homes and becoming citizens of these tribal homelands. 10 million of them effectively lose their South African citizenship. In 1953, racial segregation becomes legal. Signs specify the rights of each person according to his or her skin color. Getting deeper and deeper into an obsessional law and order neurosis, the apartheid system imposes a state of emergency, massively resorts to the military and the police, disbands protest movements, and locks up political opponents, all of which being completely legal. The numerous anti-apartheid demonstrations are repressed and blood is shed. the country slides into a spiral of violence. March 21st, 1960, township of Sharpeville. Thousands of demonstrators burn their passbooks in front of a police station. Tension rises. Policemen aim their gun at the crowd. A shot is fired. It's a bloodbath. Many children have died among the estimated 60 casualties. World public opinion is deeply shocked. So is this black man who decides this day to modify his strategy and commence armed conflict. His name is Nelson Mandela.
Withdrawal into oneself. Only 20% of the population is Afrikaner when the apartheid system is established. Fearing for its survival, the system becomes more radical and protects itself with segregationist laws. White leaders believe their only way to keep power is through repression. Black people, humiliated and deprived of almost all their civic rights, become second-class citizens. Nowadays in the State of Israel, Palestinians face massive transfers of people, strictly separated population areas, a system of pass books, and the use of Palestinians as a cheap workforce. Even though the causes are different, the consequences are similar. Communities withdrawing into themselves, violent outbursts, strong resentments which become, with time, insurmountable.
Sunday, February 11th, 1990. Cape Town area. The prison officer is living an historic moment. He is aware that his country is about to change drastically. He also knows that the 71-year-old prisoner who has just been released is different from the man who arrived in prison 27 years ago. Nelson Mandela started his political career 46 years earlier when he joined the ANC, the African National Congress, which fights for the black civic rights. As an advocate of nonviolence, he is deeply shocked by the Sharpeville massacre. In 1961, he takes part in the creation of the ANC military wing, the Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. Mandela, a man of law, goes underground and plans a campaign of sabotage. August 5th, 1962, Mandela is arrested. 2 years later, he is sentenced to life imprisonment. He is incarcerated in the prison of Robben Island, an island off Cape Town. At this maximum security prison, he suffers from humiliations and intimidations. Torture and beatings are a common practice. For years, while his country locks itself into hatred and violence, Mandela favors the Ubuntu philosophy of respect for human life, tolerance, conciliation, and no desire for revenge. Outside of prison, nothing stops his former companions in arms from pursuing his release. Fighting becomes his wife Winnie's reason for living. New, more radical protest movements emerge. The situation is escalating. In 1976, in Soweto, unprecedented riots break out in this overpopulated township. A state of emergency is declared. The army intervenes. There are hundreds of casualties. These riots, broadcasted by televisions all over the world, shock international public opinion. In a demented effort to maintain control over their country, some South African leaders ask their scientists to reduce the fertility rate of black women. The ANC military wing intensifies its attacks and even assaults the army headquarters with rockets. In 1986, an indefinite state of emergency is imposed in the whole country. Martial law is established. The government is at war with 54 townships. In order to cope with this emergency situation, many apartheid laws are abolished, but the country is still on the verge of collapse. In 1989, the nationalist F.W. de Klerk comes to power. The worst is to be expected. But the politician is a pragmatic man. He knows that Afrikaners must adapt themselves once again. Otherwise, they will disappear. It is now time to make concessions. On February 11th, 1990, after more than a quarter of a century spent in prison, Nelson Mandela is released and is a free man. The man watches the crowd, then raises his fist as a sign of victory. The white police officer who watches Mandela going away is desperately tormented by the fear of a black revenge for the dark years of apartheid.
We are now at a point of divergence. A point of divergence is a key moment, a crossroads in our history where our world can swing from one side or the other. Mandela, at the time of his arrest, had followed an intensive military training in order to run guerrilla operations. What would have happened if, that day of August 1962, he had escaped from his pursuers? From his first actions, he would have become the main target of the South African Secret Service. Considered to be a terrorist, the main goal would certainly have been to kill him. Even if he had managed to escape from the government death squads, he would have been transformed by going underground and fighting. Being more radical would have prevented him from becoming a symbol of unity and forgiveness. His wife, Winnie, would not have needed to struggle for her husband's release. Consequently, she would not have become this controversial icon of the fight against apartheid.
2018, Soweto. Born in this shantytown, this woman nearly hasn't any way out. She is one of the millions of left behind of the South African society. For her, the situation doesn't seem to have improved since the end of apartheid. And yet, in 1990, when Nelson Mandela's release generated global attention, a wind of hope swept the country. But the true reason for opening up the political spectrum was pragmatic. The country was crippled by economic sanctions and international embargoes. Nearly half of the multinationals had already left the country. The removal of embargoes was made possible thanks to Mandela's release from prison and the abolition of remaining segregationist laws. It is the end of apartheid. De Klerk has saved South Africa from bankruptcy. In 1993, both Mandela and de Klerk received the Nobel Peace Prize. Mandela was insistent about de Klerk receiving this prize as well. On April 27, 1994, Mandela becomes the first president of the Republic of South Africa. As soon as he is elected, he works for reconciliation between the different communities. A daunting task considering the deep resentments on either side. President Mandela establishes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and gives it the power to grant amnesty to those responsible for apartheid offenses. A bloodbath is avoided thanks to Mandela's wisdom and forgiveness. However, he decides not to run for re-election. The reconstruction of the country will go on without him. Nowadays, although South Africa generates 1/5 of the GDP of the African continent, more than half of its population still packs into shantytowns unfit for habitation. But that is another story.
Nowadays, South Africa remains a country of inequalities. 72% of the land still belong to white people. Unemployment in the black community is close to 40%. Even the ANC is undermined with bribery. A minority of poor white people who were protected by apartheid in the past live today in a precarious situation and are thus driven to move into shanty towns. What was a racial segregation before has now become a social class segregation. Some people start feeling nostalgic for apartheid. Some others even blame Mandela for having betrayed his people. South Africa remains a complicated country. It sank into one of the worst systems of government of the 20th century. In 1991, after years of struggles, South Africans have not only succeeded in deconstructing this racial policy, but they did it without falling into a complete civil war. Thanks to Nelson Mandela's action, they have overcome their desire for revenge. Today, the Rainbow Nation, plagued by the challenges of the 21st century, is aware that it must fight, once again, for equality.